I'm Amy Joyce. I'm one of the owners. That's Gail Weisswasser, my co-owner. We just hit our 6-month mark here at Wonderland, so we're thrilled to be here. So we've got Laura Beers, author and American University historian and professor of history, to talk about Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. The book was published to coincide with the 75th anniversary of 1984. It's an exploration of Orwell's ideas about social injustice and political deception and why they are still critical today. What a pertinent book. Laura was recently named a Guggenheim Fellow, and her book won several awards, including the LA Times Book Prize for Biography. It was named one of the New Yorker's best books of 2024. And I love this. Beers' Guggenheim Fellowship will support her work on her next book project, a comparative history of the politics surrounding IVF and surrogacy. And we also have Amanda Walker. She's a British journalist who currently hosts a weekly news magazine for Turkish television. She formerly worked as U.S. Bureau Chief for Sky Europe during the first Trump administration and made the documentary Trump, America Interrupted, which is what it does feel a little bit like. So thank you both. I'm gonna let you take it away, and thank you all for coming. We'll do this and then a Q&A and do some book signing.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm looking forward to a really interesting conversation with Laura. You've all undoubtedly heard the word Orwellian a lot in recent years. It's been used across the political spectrum. In this book, Laura brings that kind of blur of references that are often throwaway. She brings them into focus. And Laura's a historian, so what she's doing in the book and what we'll be discussing this evening is how Orwell's writing decades ago can help us re-examine the moment that we're in now. What she tries not to do in the book, I think successfully, is say simplistically, what would Orwell think about insert event? I'm going to do a little bit of that because I'm just very keen to know what Laura thinks Orwell would think about a lot of the things that are going on now. So we'll start, Laura. I can't imagine what inspired you in recent years to write a book of this nature, but tell us what made you commit to writing this book, Orwell's Ghosts.
So I wrote this book actually as a consequence of teaching a course on the early 20th century through the lens of reading George Orwell. As Amy said, I teach at American University, and I had a course that looked at imperialism and kind of debates about race and colonialism, gender politics, fascism and communism, and the crisis of liberal democracy in the early 20th century through reading the works of Orwell, who was the writer who published in the 1930s and 1940s. He had a comparatively brief life. He dies at the age of 46, which I admit I am now, so it seems very young to die, in 1950. And so he has a brief writing career, but he's writing about the early 20th century, and he's writing principally about Europe. And yet his works resonated throughout the Cold War period, and particularly in the United States, a country he never visited. And as I discovered when I started teaching this history course to my students, they continue really to resonate today. Because though we were studying the first half of the 20th century, in the classroom, our conversation kept veering to the enduring relevance of his writing. And not just his most famous books, Animal Farm in 1984, but some of his less well-known works, which perhaps we'll talk about this evening, including his novels and his book, The Road to Wigan Pier, which really focuses on the corrosive impact of social inequality in Britain in the early 20th century, but which still has a lot of relevance to thinking about the corrosive impact of social inequality in the United States in the 21st. And so out of that classroom context came the idea of writing this book, which really is, as Amanda says, it's not a what would Orwell think, right? Elon Musk famously tweeted a picture of his new t-shirt that said, what would Orwell think about, a year ago? I think he thinks of himself as a modern day Orwell, and we can talk about why that's problematic. But this is more, how can reading about Orwell help us think about the world around us in the 21st century? And how can some of the insights that he had into understanding the crises of the early 20th kind of give us tools for understanding the crises of the 21st? So that's the origins in brief.
Well, I'm interested in the use of the term today because it is used a lot. We've all heard it. I want to give you an example, Laura, that stood out to me, and I want to know what went through your head when you heard it. J.D. Vance in Europe recently giving Europe a dressing down for criminalizing far-right speech. This is Orwellian, and everyone in Europe and the US must reject this lunacy. So when you heard that, what went through your mind versus the rest of us who are far less informed on all of this?
Well, I think, and this is one of the big themes of the book, that what you're seeing there is this assumption that censorship, that Orwellian is censorship, right? And this comes out of, particularly Animal Farm and Big Brother, where he is criticizing a totalitarian regime that really imposes absolute censorship on his people, on the people within that nation. But there's a kind of underlying tension throughout much of Orwell's writing, not just those two novels, but also much of his essay writing, between, on the one hand, free speech, and on the other hand, true speech. And as I talk about it in the book, it's not clear that he privileges free speech above true speech in all circumstances, right? And famously, for those on the far left, often tend to be very critical of Orwell because of the fact that he provided a list to the British Foreign Service after the Second World War of writers on the left who he thought were politically suspect because they were overly sympathetic to Stalinist politics and who shouldn't be employed by the British government, which is something that we can debate to what degree that's sort of almost a McCarthyist approach to speech. But it does show that for Orwell, free speech was not an absolute, and what he really believed in was the responsibility of truth in speech. And one of the examples that I use in the book, and that I think kind of gets at that tension, is that critically he doesn't say in 1984, the famous line in 1984 is freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4, right? It's not the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 5. And in fact, what Winston Smith, the protagonist of that novel, is struggling against is that, the state is trying to coerce him into accepting that 2 + 2 = 5. And so freedom and freedom of speech for Orwell is the freedom to speak truly, and not necessarily the freedom to just have facts and alternate facts and say whatever you want to say.
Which is my next question, because I think that whole, we did a show recently on the notion of free speech, that idea that is free speech being able to just say whatever you want to say, or is free speech bound by truth? But then, of course, today we're all questioning what truth is. What would he have made, and here I go asking what would Orwell think, but sorry about that, alternative facts. I mean, that was a huge moment, wasn't it, in communication, coming from an administration to the people, the phrase alternative facts. I mean, it was pretty mind-blowing in the moment, and it's really still resonated in terms of the way they continue to communicate. What would have his response been to that, do you think?
Well, actually, I mean, and I, not because I was prepped in advance with this question, but because this question has come up so often, my dog-eared copy of my book actually kind of falls open to this bit where I talk about this idea of truth and fact and alternative fact. And there's a great example, I think, from Orwell's writing during the Second World War, where he talks about really the idea that there is such a thing as fundamental truth, but that we have no reason to assume that that's the truth or the narrative that's ultimately going to out. And I say, that in his writing, and you see it over and over again, he does believe that there is such a thing as, an actual definition of truth. His journalistic writing is peppered with phrases like, this was true enough, the truth was that. It would be true to say, I believe this was true. So he does believe that there is such a thing as one singular truth. But he also believes that that's not necessarily enough. And so during the Second World War in 1944, in one of the columns that he wrote for the left-wing journal Tribune, and I mean, we can talk about, I think this is something that gets lost in the way that politicians like J.D. Vance and figures like Elon Musk and Josh Hawley really use Orwell. I mean, he was someone who throughout his life identifies with the political left. But he wrote a column for this left-wing magazine called Tribune, and he said about the Second World War and about reports within the German press of fictitious bombing raids over Britain that hadn't actually taken place. Now, we are aware that those raids did not happen, but what use would our knowledge be if Germans conquered Britain? For the purposes of a future historian like myself, did those raids happen or didn't they? The answer is, if Hitler survives, they happened, and if he falls, they didn't happen. So with innumerable other events over the past 10 or 20 years, and then he lists several examples, and he says, in no case do you get one answer which is universally accepted because it is true. In each case, you get a number of totally incompatible answers, one of which is finally adopted as a result of physical struggle. History is written by the winners. And so I don't think that Orwell believed that there are facts and there are alternative facts. I think he believed there are facts, but I don't think he believed that that was enough necessarily. You needed something more than truth on your side, and that what you needed fundamentally was power, because the narrative that is adopted as true is fundamentally contingent on power and not just on right.
So what do you see then at the moment, in the now that we're in this moment that we're all living in, what do you see as truly Orwellian?
Well, I think the way in which things that are obviously not true are stated with confidence as if they are true, and then debate is shut down, right? And I think, we're seeing it right now in the characterization by the administration and by, significant organs in the right-wing press of what is happening in Los Angeles. Just to take the most obvious example, or the most timely, but I think we've seen it sort of again and again. We also saw today with the firing of the whole panel of vaccine experts at the CDC, and RFK just comes out and he says, well, all these guys are engaged in malfeasance and are in the pocket of drug companies, and apparently it's factually untrue, but it's sort of just stated and asserted as if it were. And I also think that the other thing that we could really describe as Orwellian too is, as a historian, the way that history is being selectively rewritten by the current administration. And we've seen it in the kind of culling of government websites, the temporary removal, just in a sort of local Maryland case, of parts of the history of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad from the National Park Service website, which ultimately was then put back in place after a significant public protest, as were references to the history of the Tuskegee Airmen on the Air Force website. But there have been several smaller cases that are less high profile, where those kind of revisions of history have been carried out by the administration, and there's no one to check them and kind of to force a revision. And so you're seeing an ironing out of history in line with Trump's sort of stated ambition in one of his gazillion executive orders, right, to have a more heroic story of the United States be the story that we are telling about ourselves, and one that effectively then elides a lot of those moments of kind of tension and productive dissent in America's history. And I think that would be Orwellian. Orwell talks about the idea that who controls the present controls the past, and who controls the past controls the future, right? He was very conscious that ability to control the historical narrative gave you power not just in the present, but allowed you to perpetuate power into the future.
There's a lot, basically. A lot.
Yes, it's a lot to unpack.
I want to move on slightly, and one of the chapters I enjoyed the most and surprised me and shocked me on many levels was the chapter on feminism. And you clearly respect George Orwell. He is clearly a misogynist, was a misogynist. And those, I think many of us will have read, perhaps during our nascent school years, certainly in my case, and we kind of live with this understanding that we gained then. Reading those particular sections were shocking to me in terms of the language that he used and the violence towards women in those words. And this really interests me, because when it brings in cancel culture, I am always instinctively put off by that. And I think, do I want to enjoy this person's work when they have expressed certain views? We've probably all had that internal wrestling with ourselves. You have been very clear-eyed in this book. You're not hiding anything or denying anything, yet you come out with that level of respect. I'm interested in what went through your mind in reaching that point where I can still get the good out of this, because there is so much of it, whilst acknowledging that there was a lot of very questionable stuff.
And so I think when I started at the beginning and I said that my students really inspired the book, actually one of the ways where I really see the inspiration from them is those conversations about whether or not we sort of throw the Orwellian baby out with the bathwater. To what degree should the instinct to cancel Orwell, both because of his gender politics, and I'll talk a bit more about those, and also because of some of his more problematic racial language and racist assumptions. And he was someone who, at the time, was on the side of the angels in terms of an anti-colonial politics. He was a very outspoken opponent of empire from his early 30s. But he also had the kind of casual racism of a product of his time that shows up in his writing, even his writing that's explicitly anti-colonial in its messaging. And for a lot of my students in particular, I mean, there's a kind of visceral, ugh, this guy is yucky. I mean, what do we do with him? Why are we reading him? Why are we talking about him? And it was something that we discussed, that we still discuss. I'm teaching my Orwell course this summer as we speak, in those seminars. And I am clear-eyed in the book. I mean, there's, I discuss his very kind of, complicated relationship to imperial politics. And he's someone who comes out of an imperial background. I mean, his family's money initially dating back to the early 19th century comes from the slave trade in the Caribbean. And he continues, his father worked in the empire, and he, as a young man in his early 20s, works in the empire. And there is a complicated racial politics, but there's also a very complicated gender politics. And I think it's not one that you can excuse by saying, oh, he's a product of his time, because his time is actually the moment of the first wave feminist movement, right? I mean, this is when women are gaining the vote and access to the professions in the United States and Britain and in many parts of Europe, though in some places women don't gain the vote, Belgium and France, until the Second World War and after. But he's not engaging with feminist politics. For him, the dynamics of gender really are very traditional. His wife, ironically, is much better educated than he is. He has quite a posh, elite prep school education, but he doesn't go on to college, to university. His wife has both a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology. When they marry, she gives up her career ambitions and basically becomes his glorified secretary. And he thinks, oh, well, that's as it should be. But he also, within his writing, there are kind of repeated tropes of real sexual violence, which I highlight in the book. And if you think back, I don't know how many of you guys have read 1984. How many of you, has it been a while since you've read 1984? So maybe, it slips your mind. And I read it for the first time. I grew up around here. I went to Holton Arms for high school. I read it at Holton with a male English teacher who certainly didn't want to talk about rape fantasies, right? And so you get to the part where there's quite a violent rape fantasy early on in the novel, before Winston gets to know Julia. And he sort of imagines raping her and then shooting her with arrows or bashing her head in with a rock, and he kind of viscerally describes it, right? And it's not anomalous within Orwell's writing. There are a lot of descriptions of sexual violence, of fantasies of murdering women or violently harming them, and they're kind of casually inserted and rarely unpacked. And there are also, and I discuss this in detail in the book, one of his novels, one of his lesser read, particularly in the US novels, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, really centers around the question of whether or not a woman will have an abortion. It's about this kind of loveless relationship between these two people. And ultimately, their loveless relationship becomes a loveless marriage because the boyfriend, can't countenance the idea that the woman will have an abortion. And so the woman sort of, effectively, her options are, she has the abortion and potentially dies of sepsis, because it'd be a backroom illegal abortion. She marries this guy who doesn't love her and doesn't really want to be married. Or, she has an unwed child, loses her job, and kind of, is permanently disgraced. And it's a sort of, a very sad and sympathetic story to read, from the perspective of a woman reading it now. But Orwell's eye throughout the story is not on the woman, but on the male character, right, who is struggling with his own, do I become a suburban domestic father, and how will that wreck my ambitions and my revolutionary idealism? And I think that sort of knee-jerk male gaze that you see throughout his writing is something that I talk about, but I also talk about in the context of how it relates to his idea of himself as on the progressive left. And that tension between someone who feels very comfortable self-identifying as on the progressive left and also can be casually misogynistic.
Right, so why is it then that someone who identifies as those things and believes in truth and, did so much research and probably saw inequality there, why did he choose to not let gender inform his arguments on injustice and inequality? I mean, does that disappoint you? would it be different now?
I don't know that it would be different now. I mean, we think about the modern day left, right? And there are a lot of men who consider themselves on the progressive left, who aren't necessarily feminist in all of their approaches, right? Within the Venn diagram of politics, most feminists think of themselves as on the left. Not everyone who's on the left thinks of themselves as a feminist. I mean, I wrote this book before Kamala Harris, took over for Biden as the presidential candidate. But we saw, I mean, the politics of Harris's campaign are complicated and multifaceted, right? But I mean, certainly amongst the things that we saw in those brief months of her candidacy was a significant misogyny manifesting itself within the left of the party in terms of their response to her elevation. And I think we also saw that in terms of Biden's unwillingness really to champion her when she was vice president as well. But I also discuss, and we've seen a real shift post-Dobbs, right, in the rhetoric on abortion within the Democratic Party and a real falling into line behind, the sanctity of a woman's right to choose. But before Dobbs, I think, and part of the way that you get to Dobbs is there was much more hesitancy to talk openly about abortion rights within sectors of particularly male parts of the Democratic Party, and you saw it certainly with Biden in particular, if you look at the trajectory of his political career. And that's something I talk about in the book in the context of Orwell's own attitudes towards abortion. So he is flawed. I mean, he's not someone who, from our 21st century perspective, we would think, had it all right. But I don't think, or at least I make the case that that's not reason enough to completely cancel him and to disregard the valuable things that he does have to say about the dynamics of power, about the kind of risk of sliding into political tyranny, and of the importance of truth in speech and in writing. And I sort of, part of this book is making a case that he, like so many people, is a complicated individual, but that doesn't render him, because of his imperfection, irrelevant or no longer worth reading in the 21st century.
And in the 21st century, obviously, it's a completely different cast of characters who are leading the world. Is there anyone that you think he would have aligned himself with, anyone that he would have admired? He didn't seem to be one for expressing much kind of public admiration for anybody. But do you think there is anyone who, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to plant words, but is Bernie Sanders our modern
I was going to
equivalent?
say you could probably see him as a Bernie bro, right, if anything. I mean, I do try to be careful in the book to avoid this kind of what would someone who died in January 1950, 75 years later, if he were transported here, how would he behave? And he was, above all else, an iconoclast, right? I mean, the second half of The Road to Whig and Peer is basically him saying, we need a socialist revolution, but every other socialist in Britain but me has it wrong in what a socialist revolution should look like, right? I mean, he was very much, he was idiosyncratic in his politics, and he had the courage of his convictions to believe that he was the only one who had it right. So it's hard to, as you say, imagine him really aligning himself with anyone, but I think he would have, and maybe if he changed with the time, he would have been someone who was sort of pro-AOC. but you would have had to see him change in many ways and evolve out of a kind of knee-jerk racial stereotyping and also knee-jerk, misogyny. But he does change, and it's one of the things I mentioned, albeit briefly in the book. I mean, he is someone who grows up, and he's born in the very early 20th century, in 1903, into an upper class, as he describes it himself, a lower upper middle class, to place himself with real specificity in the hierarchy. Bethesda type background, right? And and he grows up anti-Semitic, just knee-jerk anti-Semitic, and he does self-consciously kind of course correct and he writes self-reflexively about the work that he had to do to outgrow a kind of childhood knee-jerk anti-Semitism. So he was someone who was capable of change. So it is because he's such a protean figure, and he does change over the course of his life, it is, I think, that much more difficult to put words in his mouth if he were to be resurrected today.
Sure. I'm going to open it up in just a second, but I'd just like to ask you a question or about your process. I'm sure we're here in a bookstore. There's a few of us who've had a thought about writing a book one day, who knows? But in terms of your experience of doing that, it's not your first, I know, but what has stuck with you about the process of writing this book? You are working full time, you have a young family. What did you love about doing it? What did you hate about doing it? What might you do differently in the future?
I mean, in fairness, I was on sabbatical when I wrote this book, so I do have a full-time job,
No,
but I did have space to
family.
write. Yes, there's no sabbatical for a family. And actually, my children get thanked in this. I took them on a trip to Barcelona. Orwell fights in the Spanish Civil War, and he writes a book, Homage to Catalonia, about his experience on the Spanish front and in Barcelona. And we stayed in the hotel that Orwell lived in when he was in Barcelona, and I sort of dragged the kids around to various Orwell sites, and about which they still have mixed views. So my children were very much a part of the process of the writing of this book. But the one thing I'd say about it versus the other books that I've written is it was written in a kind of white heat, and I think it was because I had something I really wanted to get out there about the value of reading this man's work in our current moment, and how it could help us see things about a present that I think is perilous, both because of the risk of kind of tyranny and the risk to free speech, which I talk a lot about in the book, but also because, and this was something that Orwell was very conscious of and committed to in his writing, the kind of crisis of social inequality. And I have a chapter that speaks, really dives into the writing that Americans in particular are less familiar with about social inequality. And I think one of the things for a US audience that is probably refreshing about the book, and the book is not written, it's not assuming that you've read all your Orwell, basically. I mean, the assumed reader is someone who has read maybe Animal Farm in 1984, one or the other, in school many years ago, right? I mean, it's not, but at the time that he died, in 1950, when he died, all of the obituaries in Britain identified him as kind of one of the great social democrats, or one of the great, socialist writers of his era, right? The obituaries of him in the United States identify him as the man who wrote Animal Farm in 1984, right? I mean, and he's not quite, at that point in 1950, been reincarnated as a cold warrior in the US, but that distinction already is very clear, because a lot of his writing on social welfare isn't published in the US until after his death, or is published by very small presses and has a limited audience. And I think he still isn't known for the full kind of complexity of his political thought and political writing on this side of the Atlantic. And so I try to put that into context. And then I will stop talking, because I do want to have, I love Q&A. But, just a few years ago, when Thomas Piketty's Capital came out and was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal review of Capital was like, Piketty should read George Orwell. I mean, what is he on about? Like, this is redistributive tyranny. And I was thinking, actually, George Orwell, I mean, in terms of people he would be on board with, he would be on board with most of what Thomas Piketty had to say about inequality and the damage that it does socially. And it sort of, I think, exposed the way for American readers. He represents really this anti-authoritarian politics, but his own politics, while they were very much anti-authoritarian, were more complex than just that. And so the book, it kind of explores his broader career as a political thinker.
Okay. Well, let's open up the conversation. Any questions? Hi, go ahead.
So, for those of us whose Orwell reading was well in the past, what would you recommend reading prior to reading your book, if you wanted to pick one?
I mean, my favorite, so when the book came out, the press had to go through and determine what type of permissions from the Orwell estate they were going to request and to pay for. And the one that they came up with was The Road to Wigan Pier. They said, we've counted the amount of quotation from all of Orwell's work in this book, and the book that you quote the most is The Road to Wigan Pier. And I think that's because it is ultimately my favorite. I mean, it's such a weird book. The first half of it is kind of great social investigation. It's a guy who, as a journalist, goes up into a deeply depressed part of the north of England, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, and chronicles the misery and the experience of coal mining communities and also of the long-term unemployed. But then the second half is this kind of slightly, off the leash musings about what kind of social revolution Britain actually needs and how to go about achieving it, and why it is that the current political left is failing to attract the kind of broad coalition it needs to make change happen. And I think that's a conversation we're really kind of having in our 21st century moment in the US as well. And kind of his working through how you would get the kind of change you want to see in the world. So that would be my recommendation.
And that's your favorite Orwell book?
That's my favorite Orwell book.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. Well, I regret I didn't read that, but recently in a book club that I'm in, we actually read the biography of George Orwell by Michael Sheldon, and also read Homage to Catalonia about the Spanish Civil War, and I was really surprised about his participation. Be interesting for you to sort of talk a little bit about that, but also about his whole life, where he wasn't as successful during his life as really post his life.
Yeah.
And he went through periods of depression and really struggled as a journalist too, which I was kind of surprised to find, because like you said, 1984 and Animal Farm are so popular that you just assume that he was well regarded during his time.
Yeah, and he's someone who in the 1930s is able to make a living as a writer, but he really is a jobbing journalist. If you look at the complete works of Orwell, they include so many book reviews, because book reviews pay the rent. If any of you guys are writers, book reviews often pay the rent, right? But he writes sort of 7 book-length works over the course of his career, and it's only the final 2 that make him any kind of real appreciable money. Actually, The Road to Wigan Pier, he has a contract. It's distributed by the Left Book Club, which is a kind of subscription book of the month service. And so from that, he does, the sales are pretty good because they're guaranteed. And so he does, it helps to really tide him over. And they use that money from The Road to Wigan Pier to kind of get a farmhouse out in the countryside. But it's Animal Farm that makes him, and then 1984. And he dies just months after 1984 is published, so he doesn't really reap the fruits of that. And sadly, his first wife dies of a botched surgery. She dies of complications of an anesthetic before 1984 is written. So the person who really reaps the reward of his very end of days economic prosperity is his second wife, who he marries in the hospital, kind of on his deathbed, and he proposes to her. He's sort of sketchy, constantly proposing to women much younger than himself. But he proposes to Sonia, who does accept his proposal, saying, when I die, you'll become the executor of the Orwell estate. Like, now I'm going to be famous, and you can be my executor. And she does a good job as his executor. It was to this Sonia Brownell Orwell that was and her ongoing estate that I had to apply for permission to quote from The Road to Wigan Pier. But yeah, he doesn't. Success comes late in life for Orwell. Notably, when it does come, he buys a house on a remote island in the Scottish Hebrides, and ironically, he'd written this essay about his time at school, where though he identified himself as being a member of the lower upper middle class, right, he always felt there were people wealthier than him. And the people who were wealthier than him, their fathers drove Rolls Royces and they had holiday homes in Scotland. And so when he finally makes it big, what does he do? He gets a holiday home in Scotland. And so and Orwell makes this point, in The Road to Wigan Pier, that it's very hard to escape your upbringing. And I think that sort of, it proves it. His upbringing is to be envious of the rich kids who had a house in Scotland. And then just before he dies, he becomes one. But he was, to return to and more seriously to your earlier question about his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, one of the things that I do admire about him is he is someone who put his money where his mouth was, in that he believed he was an ardent anti-fascist before he became an anti-communist. And he was a believer when the Spanish Civil War broke out. The Spanish Civil War, the politics of it are complicated, and actually Homage to Catalonia is not the best exploration of them, because it's a very kind of niche look at one theater of the war. but in very brief, the conflict between the Republican government and Franco's forces was seen by many in Europe and in the United States as a proxy battle between fascism and democracy. And it's in that context that Orwell goes to Spain both to report on the war, which he sees as being, that a lot of lies are being told about what's happening, he thinks, back in Britain, and the British press is very unreliable as a narrator, partially because there's so many anxieties about communism and the infiltration of communism in the Republican government coalition, that the press in Britain, is not really portraying this as Franco is trying to overthrow the elected government, but as in Franco is bad, but the elected government is communist infiltrated and thereby worse, right? So he's going partially to report what he sees as, an anti-fascist truth, but then he ends up volunteering and he fights. And he describes his time in the trenches outside of Huesca, fighting in Catalonia in 1937, until he's ultimately, he's invalided out because he's shot through the throat, partially because he's very, very tall. So he comes up above the parapets when he's down in the trenches. But he also then, while he's there, when we think of Orwell, the anti-communist writer, the Orwell of Animal Farm, which he subtitles a fairy story, but is kind of, in many ways, a direct retelling of the Russian Revolution with animals. That anti-Stalinism emerges out of his experience in Spain, because while the British and French democracies, don't intervene on behalf of the Republican government, ultimately Stalin's Russia does, and Stalin's Russia asserts an increasing amount of direct control over the government in Spain. And just as they do back home in Russia, not only are they determined to fight the fascists and win the war, but they're also determined to silence any of those within the Republican coalition who don't agree with the Stalinist way of doing things. And that includes the group, the POUM, the Party of Marxist International Workers, alongside whom Orwell is fighting. And so when Orwell leaves, he leaves partially because he's been shot through the neck, but he has to flee basically in the dead of night because the government is trying to arrest everyone who's involved with the POUM as deviants from what they see as kind of the orthodox politics of the Republic. And that experience really, is Orwell's first experience of Stalinism firsthand, and makes him the kind of anti-Stalinist writer that he is really best known for in the West. But for his time in Spain, it would be unlikely that we would get Animal Farm as a novel 8 years later.
Yeah, it's sort of pivotal moment for him, and he also becomes quite disillusioned with all the mechanics of fighting and war and how senseless, and so it's very much sort of in line with a lot of the World War sort of novels of the time.
Though he doesn't turn him into a pacifist. Actually, when the Second World War starts, he's really, he ultimately dies of tuberculosis. He has weak lungs throughout his life. And so he's not accepted to fight, but he wants to be able to fight in the Second World War. And he ultimately then volunteers for the Home Guard, and, is out there drilling people up in Hampstead Heath, which, if you've ever been to London, is it's sort of kind of a comic idea that this is where the revolution will start. But, he believes the Spanish fighting is inefficient more than that he believes that war is, he's not a pacifist in that sense. But it's a great, it's a great discussion of his own personal experience in Spain, more than a history of what happens in the Spanish Civil War. But I would also recommend Homage to Catalonia. I would recommend them all, basically, except for perhaps Down Mountain Paris and London, which, as you'll see if you read the book, I don't really like that much.
I have a question for you, Laura. And you can also tell it to me tomorrow on our walk to school.
Gabe asked like 3 questions when I did my Busboys event, and I was like, "You live in my house, stop it."
So if Orwell's living today, what do you think his advice will be to build a broad coalition for the left?
So he has this line that he's been derided for as much as, it's one of his more famous lines from his writing, where he says that the problem with the left is that it tends to attract cranks. And he says, and he has this definition of cranks that's somewhat problematic. I mean, his definition of cranks is every nudist, fruit juice drinker, health cure nut, like pacifist, feminist. Feminist is his last one. He ends on, and of course, feminists are amongst the crankish, like loonies of the left, right? But Orwell, and this is something we can debate, right? And people do debate. For Orwell, the left was going to succeed by seeming normcore, right? That like the kind of lunatic fringe who were attracted to left-wing movements needed to be sidelined because they scared decent, normal people. And he thought that the way that you were going to get a meaningful social revolution was to attract the center, was to convince people who worked in office jobs or who owned small grocery stores or whatever that actually their interests were aligned with the working class and not with the capitalist class. And that there was the kind of 1%, and then there was everybody else, and that you had to kind of bring these people together. And the way that you did that was to kind of try to shake off the associations that people had in their minds of the left with the lunatic fringe. And there are obviously people in the 21st century who very much feel that that is the path forward for the left, right? I mean, Gavin Newsom would probably be totally on board with this Orwellian reading of like how you save the left. But it's up for debate. But that was Orwell's view of how you got a revolution, Vanessa. you disassociate with cranks and you bring the normal center on board with you, and then you overthrow the 1%.
So a moderate.
Yeah, he was in that sense a moderate. I mean, many of his political views, I mean, what he wanted to do, what he thought should happen once the revolution came was not moderate. I mean, he believed that income should be limited through progressive taxation so that the wealthiest had no more than 10 times the income of the poorest within Britain. I mean, he believed, in the immediate independence for India and other parts of the empire. I mean, he believed in a lot of things that were super radical for the time, but his approach to making those arguments was to play to the center.
Any more questions? Go ahead.
Oh, thank you for writing this book. It's just so important, so timely. I'm just curious. You said you're teaching undergraduates or graduate students?
So this is an undergraduate core class, actually.
Okay.
I first taught it in Britain back in 2016, when actually what students really focused on then was the amount of disinformation surrounding the Brexit campaign, which had just happened at the moment that I first taught the course. And when they were reading about kind of manipulation of news in the Spanish Civil War and the Ministry of Truth in 1984, and the way that pigs changed the commandments in Animal Farm, Boris Johnson was their referent in terms of thinking in the present tense. But over the past several years in America, I've taught it as part of our core curriculum. And so I've taught it principally not to students in the humanities, but to business students and political scientists and communication students. I think many of the communication students, because Orwell is still taught for his writing, and he is a brilliant writer. I mean, that's part of, I think, why so many of his sins of omission and commission get forgiven. But they still see Orwell as interesting. But it's been a great experience, actually, because all of these kids who are coming to these texts, many of them for the first time, because Orwell is increasingly not taught in schools anymore, though MCPS, or at least Pyle, still reads Animal Farm in 8th grade. I've talked to Pyle students about Orwell a couple of times. But they really engaged with it. And so it's nice to see a bunch of kind of 19, 20-year-olds kind of riled up by the need to...
Well, yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because we were all reading this in different times, but young people today, I mean, are they coming up very directly with parallels before the discussion even starts? What sort of things are they saying to you as they live during this time and read Orwell's work?
I don't know. We just had our Animal Farm discussion on Monday, actually, and one of the things that they really, got into and were unpacking was this question of what your kind of obligations for action are. And for those of you, how many of you guys have read Animal Farm at some distant point? Yeah. So interestingly, we've got more 1984 than Animal Farm, I think, which perhaps suggests the way that, it has a longer shelf life as a more broad critique of tyranny, whereas Animal Farm's kind of focus on, it was written, and and I talk about it still as an analog for the Russian Revolution, but I think it's still profitably read as a broader discussion about the way that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the need for vigilance against kind of accretion of power by a central executive. And that was something that my students definitely picked up on in class. But they also, were very interested in talking about the need for action for those who have the ability to understand and critique what is happening. And there's a character, Benjamin, the donkey, who is, unlike many of the animals, is literate. And who can recognize the pig's regime as basically a con, but who doesn't speak out until it's too late. And we ended up getting into a big discussion about kind of Orwell's politics and his commitment to speaking out throughout his career, and about the obligation of sort of young people to speak out, and also the ways in which that's particularly difficult for young people who, a sad truth, which I can tell you from teaching both undergraduates and graduate students, is that young people in their 20s feel pretty disempowered at the moment. But
their own free speech is being curtailed.
Yeah.
In an academic setting, is that something that comes across in your conversations with them? It's more pertinent in that setting.
Well, one of the things we talk about in all sorts of classes across the university now is just the degree to which students feel the need to self-censor. And I think that's sort of coming from both the left and the right? You sort of have this fear of being doxxed if you say something, that is seen as like overly woke but you also have this fear of, if you express any kind of controversial in a university setting, which is very left-wing, any kind of more conservative sentiment, that you'll be, that the other students in your classroom will look askance at you. And I think that is the type of scenario from either direction that Orwell certainly would not have approved of. Right? He believed in the right to he believed that truth would emerge through productive dialogue. But in order to have that happen, you have to have a space where you can have productive dialogue, right? And neither people feeling they have to self-censor conservative views because people on the left will be judging them, nor people feeling they have to self-censor their more radical views because they might end up, exposed on TikTok or whatever. And that is not a situation that we are living in, or that young people in particular are living in right now.
Any more questions? Well, it was a great conversation. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you
this
for
is
doing
a great read, and unexpectedly, if you haven't read it, please do, because you get to find out what George Orwell has in common with Jamie Oliver and Gwyneth Paltrow. That's not a tease. Thank you all so much. Thank you.